So thanks everybody for joining. As it says, this is a webinar on protecting local wildlife sites. My name's Jess. I'm a conservation officer with the Sussex Wildlife Trust. And I'm doing this webinar on behalf of the Sussex Planning Network for Nature as well, which I'll talk about later. So just briefly, my role at the Wildlife Trust is to work on advocacy, policy and planning. So really, we talk about defending nature and giving nature a voice. So working with local authorities and new MPs and decision makers to try and influence them to make good decisions for wildlife, and also to defend nature to try and stop any more harm. So this, I'm just going to move on to, these are, let me try, see if I can do this. There we are. So this is the aim of this webinar. What are local wildlife sites? Why are they important? What does the planning system do to try and protect them? How's that related in Sussex, and what other people can do to help? Just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded so that it can be shared afterwards with participants who weren't able to come and with the wider network. But you're all hidden, so none of you can be seen, so that's fine. The plan is for me to speak for about half an hour, I think, and then that will leave half an hour for questions and discussions. Whilst I'm giving the presentation, I can't keep track of the if you're submitting questions in the Q&A box, I can't read that and give the presentation at the same time. So if we could save the questions, you're welcome to put them in, but I won't be able to read them till the end. I'm pretty sure there's a function that I can allow you to speak and actually ask your question. So it might be that we do that. It's a bit more friendly, but there's no requirement. If you don't want to speak, you can just use the chat box. And I think that's about it. And we can get started. So with this slide, just for information, this picture is Woods Mill, which is Sussex Wildlife Trust's current headquarters. And part of that it's a nature reserve owned by the Sussex Wildlife Trust, but it is also a local wildlife site. So all of the photos you're going to see in this are of local wildlife sites. I'm just going to have a drink. Apologies, I am recovering slightly from a cold, so hopefully I will get through this. Okay, so question one, what are local wildlife sites? Well, the sort of dry technical definition is this. So a non-statutory site that contains features of substantive nature conservation value. So non-statutory means, i.e. they don't have statutory protection through law, like our international sites and our nationally designated sites. So international sites would be things like special protection areas or special areas of conservation, and national sites would be our national nature reserves and our sites of special scientific interest, SSSIs, and they have statutory protection. Natural England is responsible for, trying to keep them in good condition and, do permits and things around them, whereas local wildlife sites are not statutory, so they don't have that legal protection. But just because they're not nationally protected doesn't mean they're not incredibly important. So, excuse me, here are some examples of Sussex local wildlife sites. So we have Lavington Church here, which is a beautiful churchyard. We have, I think that's Beauport Park, which is in just north of Hastings. It's a really big woodland. That's Shoreham Beach, where you can see all the vegetated shingle. And that is Brighton and Hove Golf Course, which has got lots of chalk grasslands. I'm just going to mute for a minute and cough. Hold on. Apologies. Right. So these are some examples in Sussex. So they're really valuable for wildlife, really interesting sites, but they don't have that statutory legal protection. But really, what they are is anything that's good for wildlife. So the variety of a local wildlife site, they can be, some of them are like strips of meadow next to a road. Some of them are like publicly accessible parks and things like that. I think one of them in Sussex is a green wall, and wetlands, and all kinds of habitats. And they also, you find local wildlife sites across the country. And they it's a network of sites across the whole country. I believe in England, local wildlife sites cover about 5% of the land cover. So, it's significant. And, I've kind of said they're important habitats, but you can also say, what else makes them important? And really, it's, like I said, the wildlife. So here's a selection of wildlife that you would find on some of Sussex's local wildlife sites. So that bar now in the top right-hand corner, that's a picture from Tide Mills, which is a big local wildlife site next to kind of between New Haven and Seaford. I believe the adder and the orchids in the middle, that's from Brighton and Hove Golf Club. The wax caps in the bottom corner on the left, that's we've got quite a lot of churchyards with really important grassland fungi in Sussex. That's local wildlife sites. The oyster catcher, that represents Goring Gap, which is a big green area that is really important for roosting gulls and waders. The toads there because there's a local wildlife site that's just a pond, but it's a really important toad breeding pond. And the frog orchid down there is from a survey that was done at a local wildlife site last year that I think was basically a relic bit of chalk grassland. That was really amazing. And you don't really find really, really, really good chalk grassland in that many places. So what I'm kind of saying is that they're not nationally statutory, they're legally protected, but they have quite a lot of them have as equal value as things like SSSIs, or more. Some of them are so special. And then the other reasons they're important. This is an infographic that the Wildlife Trust nationally put together. Kind of just shows a lot of the other reasons why local wildlife sites are important. I mean, it's lots of the reasons why wildlife in general is important. What they provide to us. And the fact that they're stepping stones in a wider network that wildlife relies on to move through our landscape, adapt to climate change, and thrive, really. If you were to just have internationally and nationally protected sites, they, would be scattered across the country. And you really need these other places to link up. And more in between as well. We need to recover nature in between these local wildlife sites and join them all up. That's, what we're all working on to try and do. So as you can see, local wildlife sites are really important, even though, so I just don't want anyone to be deceived by the name local, to think that they're not as valuable as they are. Right. So this is Sussex, showing all the local wildlife sites we currently have. So I can't remember the exact number. It's over 650, I believe. You can see the different colours are related to when they were surveyed, which I'll explain about in a minute. But you can see that they do have good coverage from all areas of Sussex, on the coast, inland, along our rivers, everywhere. Some of them are teeny tiny, like a green wall. Some of them are pretty big. So I don't know if you can see right in the east of the country, there's quite a long one, which is the Breed Valley. That's a really big local wildlife site. And yeah, so this is picture. Sorry, I'm going to have another drink. And they were first designated in Sussex in the 1990s, I believe. And it was done by a partnership, the Biodiversity Partnership, of technical experts and local experts. And they kind of came up with a selection of sites and assessed them and determined them to be the local wildlife sites. So that's the majority of these sites have been designated since the 90s. However, there have been a few new ones designated, but not so many. And the reason is because given that they don't have any statutory or legal requirements, sadly, local wildlife sites can be under-resourced and kind of fall through the cracks a bit. And so for a long time, over the years, there's kind of been better times and worse times. And for a long time, they were the system kind of knowing, the maps of where they were, the data about the sites, who the owners were, because that's another thing. Local wildlife sites can be owned by anyone. Some are owned by charities like us, some are owned by local authorities, but the vast majority are owned by private landowners. So that information about who owns it, where it is, what state it's in, sort of collating that information for a long time sat with the county councils or the local councils. And it was a bit of a mismatch. So some did really well and had quite a lot of resource and managed the system really well, some less so. But in more recent years, it was there was the impetus to try and get things going again. And the Sussex Local Wildlife Site Initiative was created. So this is a partnership programme. It's hosted by the Sussex Wildlife Trust via the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre, but it's really independent and funded by various partners, mostly local authorities. And the kind of impetus for doing it was to re-establish a functioning system, like I said, of knowing where they are and all of that. And the real driver for it was so that local wildlife sites could be accurately represented in local plans. So we're going to talk about that a bit later, about the planning system, but it's interesting that that's one of the drivers for getting the Local Wildlife Site Initiative going. I would really recommend you having a look at their website, because it does explain quite a lot about local wildlife sites. So you can do that at your leisure. But I'll give you a brief summary of how it works. So basically, it consists of this is vegetated shingle from another local wildlife site. Very nice looking. It consists of a survey officer, Dan, and he goes out and surveys local wildlife sites. He writes reports, maps the habitats that are there and anything else of note, and then writes a report and puts a recommendation for the local wildlife site. Should it still be a local wildlife site? Should the boundary change? Should anything be added? That kind of thing. And then that information is all collated together by a support officer who's part-time. So it's a very limited resource. So we've got Dan doing the surveying and Becky doing the admin, basically. And that information then gets collated and given to a technical panel who then assess the information and decide, like I said, should it be retained, that kind of thing. And the way the technical panel decide is against criteria. So there's national criteria for local wildlife sites, which is the DEFRA criteria. And then there's local criteria that's been created by the initiative in partnership with various people, which basically just adds a few other criteria that we think is really important in Sussex, that's Sussex specific. And I think here, this is Graffham, which is another local wildlife site, nice heathland. You can see here, I'm not expecting you to read it all. This is an example of an assessment against the the Sussex criteria. So does it have protected species on the site? Does it have a relic population of internationally, nationally, or locally rare species or assemblages that are related specifically to Sussex? Does it have mosaic habitats? Wildlife, is it a wildlife corridor? Does it have sand rock exposure, which is quite a Sussex specific habitat you get a lot of in the northeast of the county? And or is it to do with expanding an existing local wildlife site? And then the more detailed criteria is the DEFRA criteria, which you can see here, which talks about lots of things about, you know, typicalness of the habitat, fragility, diversity, that kind of thing. But the point here really is to say that local wildlife sites are very much an evidence-based system. So decisions are made on, you know, surveys that are done by a qualified ecologist and based on criteria. So it's, you know, tries to be a non-political, non-biased decision. You know, is a site still good enough? Is it, you know, the technical panel I know are very reluctant to, you know, what's the word? Stop a local wildlife site from being a local wildlife site. They would only do that if it's been completely destroyed, if it's not recoverable in any way. But, you know, there's often things like boundary tweaks and things like that to try and keep the system robust, and that you know, you're defending a system that's accurate and useful. So I'll just carry on. So that's how the local wildlife site initiative works. But I would say, bear in mind that it's been running since about 2018, I think. I'm not part of the initiative, but I am part of the Sussex Wildlife Trust, so I do know about it. And I think Dan's able to survey about 30 sites a year, and as I said before, there's over 650 existing local wildlife sites. So there's a lot to get through, and just to get us to a place where we have relatively up-to-date data on all of the sites, because some of them haven't really been surveyed since they were designated back in the 90s and could have had quite significant changes to them. But the question is, why was the initiative driven by this, you know, accurately reflecting local wildlife sites in local plans? What is that element about? And that's what I really want to talk to you about, because it's they don't have legal protection, but local wildlife sites should have protection through the planning system. So there's an overall, some of you might be surprised to hear, but there is an overall duty on public bodies to have regard for conserving biodiversity. So that's the overall thing. They should be thinking about biodiversity in most of their actions. But specifically the planning system, our planning system currently is based around the National Planning Policy Framework. So this is a document produced by the government that sets out how planning should be organised at a local level. So you have your local planning authority, and they use the National Planning Policy Framework to write a local plan. The local plan then sets out what is going to be, well, what and where things should be built, and how they should be built. So, you know, what things need to be taken into account, including, hopefully, the environment, biodiversity. So the NPPF is quite a long document, and it says various things. It has things peppered. It has things about the environment peppered through it. So, for example, right at the start, it talks about the planning system having an environmental objective and that it should be improving biodiversity. But then the sort of detail of it comes in the chapter 15, which is conserving and enhancing the natural environment, which is, you know, a fairly good chapter. It starts off straight away talking about the planning policies and decisions. So the policies that are in the local plan, but also the decisions being made on actual applications by planning officers or planning committees should contribute and enhance natural and local environment by protecting and enhancing sites of biodiversity or geological value. So what does it mean by sites of biodiversity value? Well, you go a bit further down to paragraph 185, and that's when it really talks about local wildlife sites. So it talks about identify, map and safeguard locally designated sites, specifically that plans should do this, so that local plans should safeguard locally designated sites and identify and map. So identify and map, that's really clear. That's one of the reasons why local authorities were wanting a better system so that they could, you know, robustly map these sites as part of their local plan, as part of their policy map. But what does safeguard mean? Well, luckily, the government, because although the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, is, you know, quite long, it's briefer than previous iterations of planning policy. And so to help people decipher it, the government created the National Planning Practice Guidance. So this is a website that is what it says. It's guidance, but it sets out more detail about elements of the NPPF that people, local authorities should be considering. And basically there's a natural environment section, and you can scroll through that, and there's lots of questions about lots of different things. One of the questions is, how can plan making bodies identify and safeguard local wildlife sites and local geological sites, which are another local designation, but I'm not going to talk about them today because that's another thing. And this is what it says. I mean, this is paraphrased. It's a quite a lot longer paragraph, but it basically says what I've said already, that their local wildlife sites are areas of substantive nature conservation value and make an important contribution, and that plans should identify and map them, but they should also include policies that secure their protection from harm or loss, and also help to enhance them and their connection to wider ecological networks. So me, as a Sussex Wildlife Trust person, I feel like that's quite clear cut. However, the problem with the planning system is that the NPPF contains a lot of things that local plans should do. And when you actually get down to on the ground of you know, trying to actually plan where things go, some of the things, they don't exactly contradict each other, but obviously there's you know, compromises that have to be made and balances. I would say that the compromises shouldn't be about local wildlife sites, but I'm sure someone else would say that about something else. But the issue is that whilst I think this is quite explicit, that policies should secure their protection from harm or loss, in reality, when you look at local plans that have been either already adopted or are in the process of being adopted, because local plan making is an ever, you know, turning wheel. As soon as one's adopted, they start working on the next version. And the ones that have been adopted or nearly adopted, I'm going to show a couple of examples of what it actually says about local wildlife sites. And I haven't picked on these local authorities for any reason. It's just ones that I knew what they said. All of the local authorities in the planning authorities in Sussex, there's 16, if you include the county councils and the national park, do say stuff about local wildlife sites, and they're all fairly similar with slight differences, but these are just some examples. I did say that secure the protection from harm or loss. So Worthing, this is an adopted plan, and what their policy says is that development that's likely to have an adverse effect on a local wildlife site will not be permitted unless it can be demonstrated that the benefits of the proposal outweigh the need to safeguard the nature conservation value of the site. So there's a caveat. So although they say you do need to safeguard the site, they said there might be reasons why the proposal would outweigh that. So it's not a terrible policy. It's relatively positive, but then it comes down to the planning officer and the planning committee and decisions about what outweighs what. And sadly, often the environment falls lower on the list, although more recently it has slightly changed. Chichester, so this is not adopted. It's going to examination in public. So a planning inspector is going to look at it fairly soon and decide whether it can be adopted or not. But assuming it does, then it says development proposals will have an impact on designated sites, basically should meet the following requirements. And then for locally protected sites, it says you need to provide an ecological impact assessment, which is good. So you need some ecological information to explain like what the harm's going to be and why and how it can be avoided. But it says that if harm can't be avoided or mitigated, it will be refused. That's positive, unless exceptional circumstances outweigh the adverse impacts. So kind of similar that there's this caveat, but I would say that this is quite a good, strong caveat. You know, exceptional circumstances is quite a strong thing to have to meet. So in general, I think this will protect local wildlife sites relatively well if it's applied correctly by planning officers and everybody else. But you know, that's another one. And then finally, Wealden, which is at an earlier stage than Chichester, they've had a consultation on their draft plan, but it's not anywhere near going to the inspector yet. They've got a very long policy, and again, they talk about following the mitigation hierarchy of avoiding impacts first. If you can't do that, mitigate. If you can't do that, compensate. Say it will apply to local wildlife sites, and that they might be able to permit planning permission if you followed the hierarchy correctly, but they talk about the remaining area of the site will be protected by a condition, and you'll have to do compensation. So that's basically indicating, oh, maybe you can develop some of the site and do something good with the rest of the site, which is something that we do see. People say, oh, this local wildlife site's in quite bad condition. There's not really any money to manage it. So let us develop this little bit of it, and then we'll use the money to manage the rest of it well. Which as a wildlife trust, we don't agree with. We don't think that should be how you fund managing local wildlife sites, because they are so special. But it does sometimes get through. So these are some examples of how the national policy has actually been relayed to local policy. So you can see that even though the national policy, I would say, is relatively clear, it doesn't necessarily mean that local wildlife sites are fully protected. I would say I think they're better protected than they were, because when the NPPF first came out, it didn't have the same level of guidance. It didn't have that clear-cut policy wording. So we were seeing a lot more threats to local wildlife sites then. So in terms of what this means on the ground to local wildlife sites in Sussex, we've had some successes, I would say. So example would be this one in Worthing. There was, when they were doing their local plan, a developer put forward this site to develop. So you can see the little red outline. And you can see on the right that the hashed yellow is the local wildlife site. So you can see that the fields in the middle are not local wildlife site, but it's completely surrounded by local wildlife site, and the tree belt in the middle is included in the boundary. So Worthing Borough Council did say that they didn't think it was a suitable site, but the developers kept arguing that it should be included, and we supported Worthing to refute that, basically saying, you know, it was too much pressure on the local wildlife site. You can see that there's development to the east and the south of the local wildlife site anyway, and you know, a road, they would have had to cut straight through that tree belt to put in a road and things. And luckily the planning inspector agreed with us, so that site was not included in the local plan. So that's really positive. That's a success. And it's one of the reasons why the Wildlife Trust does spend time trying to comment on local plans and actually attend examinations in public, because we find that having an actual conversation with the planning inspector, you can often have more influence. But it's not all positive. We've also had some failures, a few failures. So an example of that would be in Brighton. This is from the Brighton City Plans policy map. So you can see the dotted area is Benfield Valley, which is the local wildlife site. But you can see the hashed yellow, sort of striped yellow, that's the 2 site allocations that have been included in the plan. And we did the same thing. We went to the examination, we argued with the inspector about the wording of safeguarding. But in the end, she decided that these sites could be allocated and it wouldn't harm the local wildlife site overall. But I would say that it wasn't just the Wildlife Trust arguing for this site. There was a really active local group, the Benfield Valley Project, who did really amazing work, and they are still active. They still are still active. They use the site regularly. They run engagement events for people and survey the site and things. And so I know that when a planning application actually comes in for that site, they're going to do their best to try and stop it or minimize it. So it's not, we're not giving up yet. And so yeah, that's what the planning system, that's sort of how it's been related to Sussex. But there is some potential strengthening of protection, which is through local nature recovery strategies, which is a relatively new requirement initiative from coming out of the Environment Act, that responsible authorities need to create these local nature recovery strategies, which are basically, as I say, strategies to recover nature. So in Sussex, we have one for West Sussex and one for East Sussex and Brighton and Hove, but they're working collaboratively. So it's basically going to be 2 strategies, but they're going to fit together. They're not allowed to overlap. And the idea is that you map what you already have, what the important areas for wildlife, and then you also map where you should target work to recover nature in between those areas, to basically join them up, create more of a coherent ecological network across the county and then the country. So it's an ongoing process. This is a website set up for it, and on there you can see kind of how they're progressing. As I said, the responsible authorities are the county council, so they're the ones driving it, not the Sussex Wildlife Trust is getting involved and commenting and all of that, but we're not organising it. But on their website, you can see an example map of, this is a draft map of where they've mapped the designated sites, and they've included all the local wildlife sites, which is fantastic because they should be included because they're so important. And this is based on guidance from DEFRA about what should and shouldn't be included. They've also included all the irreplaceable habitats that we're aware of. Lots of that isn't necessarily in designated sites. So then from that, they're going to try and build up, this area of trying to focus our work and effort and money to have the biggest impact for where you recover things. But interestingly, in the guidance, it says this, which is potentially that if responsible authorities think that additional areas need protection, they should think about making them local wildlife sites, which is an interesting thing for the guidance to say, because it makes it seem like it's quite easy to make something a local wildlife site, but actually it's really difficult because, as I said, we don't really have any resource. We're currently trying to work the local wildlife site initiative is currently trying to work through the existing sites and get them surveyed and up to date. So then to put additional work of designating new sites, that's a whole another kettle of fish that would require a lot more resource and a lot more time, which currently is not available. So I'm interested to see how it pans out. And it would be fantastic if the initiative got more resource. But currently it doesn't seem that likely. And that's also a plea to all of you, that I know that when we talk about local wildlife sites, often people think about areas that they know of that they really want to be protected. We completely understand that, but realistically, trying to get more local wildlife sites designated is not going to happen anytime soon. We've got to try and protect the ones we already have. So the other issues I'd kind of like to highlight, which isn't really well, apart from a lack of resource and potentially a lack of knowledge and understanding about local wildlife sites, which is a bit tricky to get around, really, because the fact that so many are owned by private landowners, it's not it's not possible to share information about all local wildlife sites, because it's someone's private land and there's no public access. So another issue is lack of management. So yes, development pressure is a big threat in Sussex particularly, and the southeast. But another really big issue with local wildlife sites is a lack of management. So this is an example of a lot of scrub on a local wildlife site that was chalk grassland when it was designated. There are other areas of this specific local wildlife site that are still in good condition, and the landowner is doing work. So it's hopefully going to be can be turned into a positive situation. But in general, the lack of management of local wildlife sites is an issue. In fact, the Wildlife Trust nationally created this report. It's from 2018, but it's probably still quite true, where they looked across the whole country at sort of what was happening with local wildlife sites, and they found that a lack of management was perceived to be the number one threat to local wildlife sites, with planning, with development pressure the second, all underlined by a lack of resource, really, because again, if you had a bit more resource, you could potentially go out to more landowners and give them more advice about local wildlife sites. And the Wildlife Trust, Sussex Wildlife Trust, is able to do that in some cases where we have landowner advisors and things. But again, it's a limited resource and there's a lot of local wildlife sites. So the final thing I was really going to say is how you can all help, which hopefully is one of the reasons you signed up to this webinar. And I would say sort of the main things really are to get involved in the planning process when you can. So when local plans are reviewed, try and have a look at your local plan and see what it's saying about the environment and biodiversity and local wildlife sites. Or if you're aware of a local wildlife site that you think is under threat from a planning application, let the Sussex Wildlife Trust know. We're not able to comment on all the planning applications in Sussex because there's hundreds and hundreds, but we do try and prioritise local wildlife sites where we can. So getting involved in that, where some local wildlife sites are publicly accessible or owned by local authority. So you could contact your local authority to find out what local wildlife sites they own and how they manage them. Lots of them do have friends of groups. So if you have one locally to you, you could join it and help support that. So for example, the Friends of Shore and Beach, they always need more support, more members. Managing vegetated shingle is quite hard work because there's lots of invasive species that they need to control. So things like that. And then another really important thing is to, if you know of a local wildlife sign near you, or yeah, there's one that's publicly accessible, is to record the wildlife that you see, because even though the initiative might not be able to get out there for a survey in the next year or two, just having up-to-date new records for the site is really useful. There's lots of information on the Sussex Wildlife Trust website about how to record wildlife, and the best way to format it to go to the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre. But basically, once the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre have it, then they verify the information, and then it's available for anybody to access. And if, for example, a planning application was to come in on that site, the local authority could ask the record centre for what records they have. You could ask the record centre what records they have. I could ask the record centre, and you can see kind of what up-to-date information there is about biodiversity on that site, which can be really helpful. So I'd say those are the kind of 3 key things you can do. And something to help with all these things is the Sussex Planning Network for Nature. So this is a site that's been created jointly by the RSPB, ourselves, the Woodland Trust, I think that's everyone, and CPRE, and it's basically, the idea is it's to be a hub for planning issues in Sussex, so that normal people, can get involved, can post about things that are concerning them. They've heard about a development or a planning situation that they're concerned about. They can post and try and get some advice. There's also lots of advice already on there from the organisations, kind of how to get involved in the planning system, how to comment on things. And we do try and post on there when we hear of consultations. So like the Rother local plan is currently out for consultation till Tuesday, I think is the deadline. So we've posted on there about that. So if you want to join the network, it's one of those things that the more people that join, the more activity there'll be, and hopefully we can get good discussions going and peer-to-peer support, because there's loads of groups in Sussex who've done loads of amazing work trying to defend areas, and it's a shame for them to sort of be the only ones who have that knowledge. We want it to be shared and for people to be helped. And then, as my little pre thing showed you, the elephant in the room about all of this is that we have a new Prime Minister, and a government that's very keen on getting building again. So we are, obviously, everything I've said about local wildlife sites is the current planning system, but we are expecting there to be some changes. We've heard that the National Planning Policy Framework, the government are going to consult on changes to that. They're probably going to publish the consultation before the end of July, is what they've said, before they go on summer recess. So that's pretty imminent. Obviously, we don't know what it's going to say. It might do very little to the environmental chapter. It might not say anything about local wildlife sites, but it might. So obviously, we're going to be looking at that, and I'm sure we'll be posting on the network and probably encouraging people to comment. Generally, if they're doing anything to weaken protection of local wildlife site, obviously we'll be objecting to that, but we always try and strengthen it anyway, try and get them better protection, even better protection than they have right now. So I would say it is a good time to join the network, because I think there's a lot of potential for change currently. So we'll see. Watch this space. I mean, we're not exactly sure what's going to happen, but we'll definitely be advocating for local wildlife sites, all the time, basically. And I think that's it. So I've put up any questions. I'm going to see if I can see. So basically, if you have a question, I think you can, if you're able to speak, then, or you're happy to speak, then if you raise your hand, then I can allow you to talk, to ask the question. I'm not sure if anybody has written anything in any, let me double check. Oh yeah, there's a Q&A box. Sorry, haven't found that. Right. Jeremy Hallett. Let me see. So Jeremy's asked, can the infographic be emailed to us? As that could be really useful. Yes. I can email. What I can do is that infographic was taken from the Wildlife Trusts. They've got a little sort of pamphlet thing about local wildlife sites, and that infographic's in there. So I can send you a link to the to that pamphlet. I can send it to everyone. Oh well, I think I can. I assume I have everyone's email. So, but I can definitely send it to you, Jeremy. So thank you for the question. Let me just check. Then Joanna has asked, does iRecord link up to the record centre? Yes. So iRecord every few months, I think, basically the record centre get a big download of all the records from iRecord, and then I think they're verified and then included. So yeah, iRecord's a brilliant way to record wildlife. It's quite an easy app. If people don't know it, it's a website, but it's also an app, and it can you can find the species, and you can use like a Google Maps type thing to get your location, so you don't have to faff around trying to find grid references and things like that. So I would definitely recommend that. The other thing to mention in terms of the Sussex Planning for Nature Network is there is also a Kent one. So if you happen to be in Kent, you can join that one as well, or instead, it's basically just to try and keep the information relevant, but lots of the stuff is on both of them. And then Millie has asked, are you okay to send the invite link for the planning page with anyone? Yes, absolutely. Anyone is welcome to join the Planning Network for Nature. We want as many people as possible to join, because the more people that are on it, the more likely someone will be knowledgeable to answer a question, and also the more we as the organisations hear about things, because when it comes to planning issues, when we're not statutory consultees, we don't necessarily get sent information by the local authorities, so we do often rely on local people telling us about a planning application that's happening, or a development threat. So if you can post it onto the network, that's a really good way to let us all know that something's happening. And as I said, I'm sure there's quite a lot of things that might be happening soon with threats of new towns and things like that. So I think it is a good time. So right, I'm just going to see. Oh, another question's popped up. Any plans to increase resource for the initiative? The Sussex Local Wildlife Site Initiative. Yes, I think there are plans. They had a changeover in staff, so I think they're just waiting to recruit for that. Volunteers, I think so. Volunteers are used in terms of when a local wildlife site has been surveyed and Dan's given some like management recommendations. If there's a connection, then sometimes the Wildlife Trust can use one of their landowner advisors and our volunteers to go out and do some of the management of the sites. They definitely rely on volunteers for like the public sites, but I don't think there's a plan currently to have volunteers do the surveying, because it's got to be quite done in quite a formal way to make sure that it's consistent across all the sites, because as I said, this information is then going to local plans and then being assessed by planning inspectors, and we don't want anything to be, to risk them saying that the information isn't, valid or robust, or that it's biased or whatever. So I think that's the system. I mean, as I said, I'm not actually part of the initiative myself, but that's my knowledge of the situation currently. Right. Oh, another question. All right, so Neil has said, what is the difference between a local wildlife site and a local nature reserve? So a local wildlife site is, as I've said, like I explained, that the way that a local wildlife site is designated is through this partnership system, based on the criteria and of substantive nature conservation value. So that's what makes a local wildlife site a local wildlife site. A local nature reserve is actually something that is designated by a local authority. So any local authority have the powers to designate a local nature reserve, and there are criteria for it. And obviously it does have to have some nature value, but it can be more about public enjoyment of nature, and it has to have, local nature reserve has to have public access. I think it's usually owned by the local. I don't think it has to be owned by the local authority, but it usually is. And they usually manage it. So that's the difference, really. It is a bit confusing, but local nature reserves are sort of more about people. Local wildlife sites can be about people, but they're not all. Some of them are, as I said, private land that don't really have any access. So it's not so much about local people having access to nature. So that's a difference. But local nature reserves are also in all that wording on the NPPF about locally designated sites. That probably would include a local nature reserve, but it's just the criteria when you're thinking about if there was a planning application on a local nature reserve and they were kind of trying to decide, does it outweigh harm? Like the things that they're thinking about harm on the nature reserve wouldn't just be about wildlife, it would probably be about wider things. Also, to be honest, if there's a planning application on a local nature reserve, it's usually being done by the local authority because they own the land. So that's a whole nother issue that we do see sometimes. Hopefully that answers your question, Neil. I do find I ramble a bit. Okay, let me just check if anybody else has any questions. I'm not seeing anything, and I'm not seeing anybody with hands raised. So I just want to double check. Let me see what time we're on. Oh, 5 minutes to go. So, okay. Well, if no one else has any questions, then, let me just double check. Something's popped up. No, that's an old one. So I think we're done, really. So thank you to you all for attending. I hope it's been interesting. If you do want to give any feedback, please do. And yeah, as I said, there's a recording, so you can check back on all of it. Hopefully the recording is going to be posted on the network.